Russia is paying a huge price in terms of blood and resources for every metre of Ukrainian territory it tries to seize. The encircled city of Bakhmut is emblematic of Russia's lack of strategy and purpose as it throws away hundreds of lives for every metre captured in a horrific focal point of the war that has become a meat grinder. And all this for a town that has little strategic military value, perhaps, though, some symbolism for the propagandists and elites vying for Putin's attention and approval. Will a defeat of Russia's poorly trained and equipped forces in 2023 finally bring an end to its genocidal war against Ukraine? Or will the drip feed of Western weapons cause the war to drag on for years? Please like and subscribe to see more great speakers and content on the Silicon Curtain channel. Today, I'm speaking to Artur Rehi, influential YouTuber and Estonian reserve soldier. He completed conscription in 2018 in the Kuperjanov Infantry battalion as company communications officer. He looks at the war with insight, empathy, and humour. He also explores his family's traumatic history as victims of Soviet repression and imperialism. Artur, I'm delighted to welcome you to the channel.
Hi, that was very poetic. I wasn't ready for that.
I always do a little bit of an intro. I try to vary it up a little bit. I think some of my audience like it. Some of them complain that they just want to get straight to the speakers. So
I felt like I'm like thrown into one of these documentaries from history or something, very compelling, very interesting.
That's the weird thing though, isn't it? I mean, for someone like you with a military training and an interest in history, it's an extraordinary time to be alive and to see, massive epoch-making historical events unfolding.
Yeah, and it's sometimes really difficult to understand that this was the event. I have to sometimes acknowledge that this is, when Zelensky went to, for example, to the Congress, to the United States. It's just any other day. Zelensky's in USA, every media is talking about this, but you're not going to register as it that this moment is going to be in the history books. It's going to be, but it doesn't feel like it's like just any other day. But if I really acknowledge it, that my children might be learning about this very moment, and I'm here reporting about it, then it creeps up on me.
And this is it. And we don't know. Sometimes, we'll see an event and we won't quite know what the significance of it is. So, I mean, one of the interesting stories, I think, from yesterday was Pregosian and his Wagner troops. First of all, they were cut off from being able to recruit, new soldiers from prisons. Now it turns out they're being starved of ammunition. And it's almost started like a mini sort of informational civil war between, Putin's deputies, as it were, or his various mafia groupings, as I think it's more realistic to label them. Now, of course, we don't know if that's going to turn into anything, but events will unfold, and it could be that this is, an absolutely crucial event that shapes the future. It might turn out to be nothing. I think that's the extraordinary bit in having conversations like the ones we're having.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I understand it, Putin has set up his power structure like that, so everybody's beneath him and everybody are competing for power, everyone beneath him. So Gerasimov is at the head of the Ministry of Defense, right? With Shoigu, and then there's Kadyrov and Prigozhin, who are like these private army elements, and Putin plays these forces against each other, so none of these forces get strong enough to actually challenge him. So it's a very smart move on his behalf because it keeps him in power. But in this war, it's really diminishing Russian military capabilities, because Wagner not getting ammunition really means a lot of lives lost on the front lines for Russia.
And, Wagner was already not very fussy about throwing people at the front line, was it? They've got this extraordinary tactic where they'll throw poorly equipped and poorly trained prisoners into the front line in wave after wave of sort of, just sort of human meat being thrown to use up Ukrainian energy and ammunition. And then when they feel they've made some small gains, they'll then throw the more professional better trained soldiers at the problem. I mean, that tactic, I don't know if you've seen the sort of videos around that. What's your sort of military perspective on that tactic? I imagine you're horrified, but what's your impression?
As much as I know, again, actually, I'm just an infantryman, but reading about this stuff, it seems like they're throwing away their prisoners to lure out Ukrainian artillery positions. So they're throwing this, as they call it, biomass, then they see where Ukrainians are firing at with artillery and with the machine gun nests or whatever they have in the front lines. And then the professional troops with night vision, for example, at night or at the evening or after these wave attacks can pinpoint Ukrainian locations and actually attack them with more efficiency. I think that's the goal of it, at least.
And it's producing very minor successes, which perhaps the propagandists can shout about. But there is a community, I think, that's emerged of military bloggers, and they're much less inclined to, I think, repeat the propagandistic lines, and they're much more critical of the Russian military. I don't know if you've seen any of the sort of military blogger channels or seen some of the English translations of those. What do you think of that as a phenomenon emerging in Russia? Is it the first roots of a democratic movement, or is it quite the reverse? Maybe a sort of emergence of a nationalistic, militaristic kind of group of people that are somewhat scary.
It's definitely not democratic. I think it's the opposite. It's far right, ultra right nationalists who are military bloggers, and they are quite harsh against the Ministry of Defense of Russia. They are criticizing their means, they're criticizing their failures, they're even criticizing Putin himself. So Putin is losing grip on the ultra far right military bloggers and their followers. And they don't condemn this war. They don't condemn the killing of Ukrainians. They condemn the fact that Russia is not winning or not being effective enough on the battlefield. So they call for full mobilization. For example, like Igor Kirkin, the terrorist, he says that Russia cannot win. It's physically not possible to win unless they fully mobilize the entire nation. And that's the message they send. It's a very scary message. And even Putin wants to silence these military bloggers because they have more and more power, and they can mobilize more and more Russian people against Putin.
And that's an interesting reflection as well of many ordinary Russians that we've seen too, isn't it? The West and the media in the West, and I don't know if it's the same sort of in Estonia, we constantly try to normalize the situation. And even though we understand that Russia is not a normal country, not by any means, we still try to interpret their decision-making process through the lens of our own democratic and civil society kind of system. So we would expect the mothers of soldiers to protest the war because their children are being slaughtered. Their young children are being brainwashed to become sort of, militaristic zombies, as we're now seeing with the pivot in the education system. We expect them to protest against that, but they don't. What they actually say is give them better equipment. So they're not trying to end the war. They're trying to make the war more effective.
No. It is crazy. I mean, Russian society has always loved the Tsar, loved the leader. I mean, if Stalin came to power or Lenin and they deposed of the Tsars, then people had Lenin's photo or Stalin's photo on their living room, in their living room. So nothing really changed. They still praised that one person who was leading the country. Yeah, they were communist or they were Tsars, but there was still a picture of this one man, and now it's Putin. So sending your son to die for this Tsar or Putin or leader, whoever it is under what structure, it's still an honor for a Russian family, and it's still like it's so weird for the Western people to understand. And we have different religion. They have Orthodox. It's very much different. And to send their son to die, first of all, they might get a lada for that, or a lot of rubles, or some fish, like they do in Russia.
Potatoes. I saw one last week. Carrots and potatoes was the
yeah. And if they live on the other side of Urals, where there is actually poverty and hunger, two words we really don't understand in Europe compared to Russian poverty and hunger. So these things actually matter to them. And also it's for the Tsar. So that is very important for the families also.
And I've heard some people say that, I've heard them label it as a sort of Soviet mentality, but actually Estonia was forcibly part of the Soviet bloc for a number of years, not obviously as long as Ukraine and some other territories, but for a considerable period, I think it was 40 or 50 years, you were within that sort of Soviet sphere and system. How did the Estonians, maintain their Europeanness and what clearly, you have in common with the UK and with Ukraine, which is a concept of the value and sanctity of individual life rather than this sort of collective view? How did Estonia manage to preserve its identity through that occupation by Russia?
Well, first of all, Estonians are extremely stubborn. And they are also extremely internalized. Internal, I don't know if it is if it is a strength of the people or weakness, I don't know, but they are like, it's a very bad comparison, but like cockroaches, it's hard to kill them because you oppress them for 50 years and then we do silently our own thing. We don't wave the flag, but when this red power goes away, we put the flags out again, bring them out from, where we buried them. And people tell stories, grandfathers, grandmothers. I mean, Estonians are very hard to oppress in that manner. You can do it, but if the moment arises, you'll be sorry for it. So I'd say it's a very acknowledged thing to keep the culture alive. People have told these stories. People have silently felt proud about being Estonian, and and also culturally we are Finno-Ugric. We are not connected to Russia in any way in culture, only because we're next to Russia. But our, how to say, people's tribe is connected to Finland, connected to Sami people, the Mari people in Russia, and these people are not Russian at all. So for us, our nation is very strongly connected to language. It's very hard to say you're Estonian if you don't speak Estonian. You could be American even if you speak Spanish, or you speak Chinese, but that's not the case for Estonia. So the language is kept alive, and the language is extremely different from Russian. And I think that's one of the parts how we maintained our views and nationalism.
And I think that's one of the problems, isn't it, of, say, Belarus, where and Ukraine to an extent, where the language is similar enough. It's got a Slavic root. It's extremely similar on some levels. That made it easier for the Russians to impose Russian as the sort of lingua franca, the imperial language. And in the case of Ukraine, they managed to preserve the language in the majority of the territory of the country, not all, but in the majority. In Belarus, however, the eradication of the language is almost completely successful and it's died out. So, once you lose your language, I think you lose the ability to resist the other aspects of cultural imperialism.
Yes, I mean, in Ukraine, it was also a situation where you could be Ukrainian and you couldn't even understand Ukrainian language. Before 2014, before the separatist war in Donbass, I think I don't know the numbers, but it looked like about 50% of Ukrainians spoke Russian and identified fully as Ukrainian, maybe even more, 60, 70%. But now I just went to Kiev about 3 weeks ago and I spoke English, right? And they didn't even want to speak English to me. They wanted to speak Ukrainian. I can see they understand Russian because I had a Russian friend with me. He spoke Russian and I thought he's going to be with me. We're going to be fine because they all speak Russian. In Kiev, at least, I know they understand. I can see in their eyes they understand English and Russian, but they answer to you in Ukrainian. It's a very strong choice people make now, and I'm glad they do. It made things very hard for me, but I'm glad they make this choice.
And it makes them more resilient, doesn't it? Now, I'm going to put a link into the video description because that trip you made, I think you made a fantastic sort of film quality video of your trip there. Could you describe to the audience a bit about what you were doing? Because I know you were taking some equipment over there, but what was the background to the trip, and what impressions you had when you were on it?
Yeah, there is this Estonian startup entrepreneur, Ragnar Sass, who has been delivering cars, about 140 cars already delivered to the Ukrainian armed forces. And in this convoy, he asked me to come. And I went there and I decided to shoot a whole documentary of the entire process to show people how these cars are donated, that the corruption is not going to eat away at these cars. just no middleman, given straight to the Ukrainian armed forces. And in that video, I also asked for people to donate for the next convoy, and they did. And as of now, we're standing at 52,000 euros. So that is 4 cars, out of which 2 are already in Ukraine, and 2 will be bought. And March 10th, I think they will be driving to Ukraine. So the fans have bought 4 cars. And these cars will be given to different units, and they will fulfill tasks like transporting the wounded, transporting ammunition. They will not take direct part in battles because they're civilian trucks, but they transport and they do logistics tasks, which is incredibly necessary. And you cannot put like an infantry fighting vehicle to that task because that is needed on the front. So we're fulfilling this link, which is not much talked about, but it's very necessary to fulfill.
And I think it was very interesting, that you talked about there are different needs. So there might be some sort of not time imperative needs at the front where you can use older vehicles. And if they break down, it's not going to cause a critical issue. But the vehicles that you provided, they're shiny, they're new, they're extremely robust, 4-wheel drive vehicles. I think you talked about the deployment there, that it's absolutely time critical that these supplies get to the front line, and actually sort of lives depend on it, and holding the front line will often depend on keeping these supply chains running. And therefore, the reliability of the vehicles is absolutely a critical factor.
Yeah, that's why there's only 3 car brands, and car people are over the world will be triggered now. But I say Ragnar has chosen, and wisely chosen, Toyota Hilux, of course, Mitsubishi L200s, maybe not the most reliable, but Ukrainian forces know how to work on it, and it's simply built. And then Isuzu trucks. So of course people say Ford, people say, I don't know, whatever other trucks there are in America. But the thing is, these trucks are not huge, they're not tiny, they're just in the perfect area. They're easy to work on, they don't have heavy electronics on them. You said these trucks are new, but they're not. For 14,000 euros, you can get a very strongly working truck that is about 100,000 kilometers in. So it has about half of the life ahead, even more. But it's not like these new electronics filled trucks, because electronics will die on the battlefield. They're very robust, and that's what the army needs, I think.
And that's an interesting question, isn't it, about logistics? Because we're seeing the images of this being a war of attrition, but actually it's a war of logistics, which at the moment it seems that Ukraine is winning, and Russia has not been particularly good at either protecting their supply lines, or providing the right sort of equipment at the right time to the front lines. But how do you see that panning out? And as a military person, have you been appalled at what you've seen of the way Russia has managed its supply lines and logistics?
It feels to me like Russia has paused all kind of advances in their logistical fields when the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, they had this railway logistics structure. And I think when the world evolved, then you could have made new strategies and made new logistics plans. They didn't. They just went into this war with a logistics plan which was about 40 years old, and not actually propped up for this specific invasion, but just for the entire Soviet army. But this specific invasion was heavily reliant on trains and tracks. And when these are bombed or the train hubs are not taken, the entire logistics system collapses. And the trucks, I think Russia lost like the most military trucks in the first 3 months, and then they started to have issues with the trucks. They started to use civilian trucks. They were bombed, and the roads, the Rasputitsa came, the roads were, muddy, the trucks couldn't get through. So the troops didn't get their ammunition, their food, their winter clothing. So as you said, I think Ukraine is winning the logistics war. They're slowly losing ground, but in the end, if they win this logistics war, they will gain this ground back very fast, I think.
And you've covered many topics like this. You've reviewed, military equipment, strategy, tactics, and so on. And along with, a hardcore of, I would say, sort of people with military experience, provided an absolutely invaluable commentary on the war. How did it feel, though, when your channel sort of started to take off? What's the sort of history of the channel, and how has the Ukrainian war sort of changed the type of content you produce and the sort of audiences you're getting?
Well, before the war started in January 2022, I remember I took Joe Biden's words very seriously when he said months before the invasion that it might come at any moment. And I don't know why, but I took them as the entire truth anywhere one could say about this. And I made videos about it already. Like, it's going to happen any moment, get ready. And when it did happen, I was ready. I live streamed for 7 days. I mean, 7 nights, because my viewers were American mostly back then. So I live streamed until I burned out, and I live streamed like 6-7 hour long live streams. I was really afraid because in Estonia we also had a lot of Russian forces on the border, which by now are grinded up in Ukraine. We don't have this. Russia doesn't have any forces on Estonian border anymore. But yes, I was afraid. It gave my channel a lot of new viewers, a lot of new subscribers. Before the war, I was standing at 342,000, and now I'm at 582. So it has completely changed my videos, my quality, my upload schedule, everything. So it has given my channel a new breathing, I could say. As horrible as this war is, it has also had it has given me a purpose in my job, which I like.
And of course, it's allowed us to connect with people who we may not have connected with. And I guess we're all on a learning experience. And for me, you know, coming at the topic as someone who's studied Russian history, literature, etc., I was only dimly aware of Ukraine and its separateness. And I think this whole war has been an extraordinary experience of actually discovering strong Ukrainian voices, learning so much about how the mechanics of imperial history and cultural appropriation kind of work. And every video that I'm making, at least, you know, is I learn an absolute ton from the speakers, and then are able to sort of recycle those ideas into the next interview. Have you found you've been on a similar kind of learning journey?
Oh yeah, so much. I mean, before the war, I was making reaction videos about American Abrams tank as an Estonian infantryman. Now I'm being called to the Estonian TV like 3 to 4 times already to talk about this war as an expert. I wouldn't call myself an expert. I'm just an infantryman. I haven't gone to any school, but they called me and like, come and talk about this because you have this channel. And so other people see me as that. And I'm not going to claim this title or anything, but I guess if you spend 11 months learning about this conflict, about the logistics, about the failures of both sides, you pick something up. So yeah, if you have followed it for 11 months, I guess you would be a military expert also.
Absolutely. No, I had a similar, slightly weird experience, which I think the audience will find entertaining. And similarly, I was invited to speak at a conference, but it was a conference in the US, in a huge conference center in the middle of one of the largest army bases, and invited onto a panel to talk to the combined sort of security and intelligence industry.
Wow.
And I was like, as flattering as that is,
That's
I
scary.
don't know nearly enough. And two, I found out there was no budget for expenses. So it would have cost me like, probably
Uh,
around,
that's
$5,000-$6,000 to
oh my
fund it.
God.
So yeah, it didn't happen, but it was flattering to be considered.
Yeah, it's the same feeling when they call and come and talk. It's like, okay, I don't really know. I'm just an infantryman, or just like I have no formal education about this, and it's scary. But I mean, honestly, if I've gone and went with the flow and trusted it, I guess trusted myself to know the answers, then it has been very much okay. But I wouldn't go against any kind of like military personnel or officers or generals. Then no.
It's the same. Like I wouldn't sit next to a historian and try to pretend that I knew more than I do.
Yeah.
I think it's much safer sticking to something like, say, the Russian mindset, where I can use my personal sort of experience and bring that to bear and use anecdotes and stories. Now, if we turn to your expertise, I think it's one of the fascinating aspects of this struggle has been the process of training the Ukrainian army in NATO tactics and skills. I'm assuming that, in your career, you would have been straight, you wouldn't have experienced the sort of Soviet methodology and tactics. You would have been straight onto the sort of NATO techniques, would you?
Yeah, we were full. Everything we did is according to NATO standards, and the weapons also, like everything, because Estonian army is not very big. It's quite easy. If we were doing things on the Soviet standard, then immediately if we got into NATO, we changed it because it's quite easy to change a small army. For Ukraine, it's much more difficult because they have almost 1 million men under the gun, and it's to change such a mass. It's very difficult. But training is extremely expensive and extremely vital. I mean, if you see videos of masses of Russian troops under artillery fire, you see how they act, how the mass acts. You can see what kind of training have they had, what is their procedure if the first shell is going to land near them. And at the first hours of war, I remember videos of panic, just panic, like they didn't have training at all, although they were professional forces. So NATO training has very strict standards of how you should act, what you must do, what are the procedures. You're waiting for that shell to land. If it lands, you know immediately 1, 2, and 3 what I'm going to do. And honestly, I haven't seen Russian troops drone videos. I haven't seen them react like I'm expecting a soldier to react at all. All I have seen mostly is panic. We don't know what to do. Fear, stuff like that. And if I look at Ukrainian trench warfare videos, for example, I see that they're following closely NATO standards. They're shooting single shots. They're shooting covering fire. They cover each other when they run. They don't stick their heads out if it's not necessary. They communicate to each other. And I think this NATO training is extremely vital to Ukrainian troops.
And they leave gaps between their vehicles. I saw a really interesting breakdown of a sort of convoy. They're not all bunched up together. They don't act in a kind of predictable movements. They, will leave differentiated gaps between the vehicles. I mean, it's fascinating seeing those kind of breakdowns. But there's another fundamental aspect, isn't there, of the NATO training method, which is that it's encouraging people to, in a way, think positively, to try and act rationally and strategically, but also come at things with a sort of positive can-do mindset. Whereas we also know that the Russian training is all about threat, coercion, intimidation. Have you seen, does that betray itself in the behavior of some of these clips you've seen of soldiers?
Oh yeah, so much, because in NATO forces, of course, the order is the order. You have to follow it. But in NATO forces, they do encourage a soldier to look at his surroundings and make up his mind what is the best course of action. And if the order is it's not possible to follow it, or it's extremely stupid, then it is forgiven to the soldier. And it's actually encouraged a little bit if he makes up his own mind, makes up his own decisions. In Russia, it doesn't matter about the situation on the battlefield or straight in front of the soldier. The order is the order. It comes straight from the Tsar, right? It doesn't even come from Gerasimov or Shoigu. It comes from Putin. And this order is not to be questioned. And if they don't want to follow it, it's in intimidation, as you said. So it's an extremely top-down heavy system. Fear is used. It's not trust. It's not encouragement to think for yourself. And men are actually afraid to think for themselves because they will be punished for it, because they don't follow orders in that case if they think for themselves. So immediately, if this first shell lands, you see a 10-men squad, 10-men's bunch of Russian soldiers. You can see that they have this one order: go. And the shell landed. They don't want to go anymore, but they cannot think what to do now because that's not allowed. And you can see that moment of panic and question marks around their heads. And that's 1 to 2 minutes they spend there. Whether as NATO troops, they see they cannot go anymore. We have to change the course of action. Okay, we fall back. Okay, we establish a different line of attack. There's many things to do, but Russians, they're just gonna lay there under fire, not going forward because they're afraid, not going back because they're afraid, and not doing anything about the situation. And that's when you can see these troops are unable to think for themselves, unfortunately.
And of course, unskilled nature of the troops and this inability to or unwillingness to give those troops any kind of agency or control over their actions, that also dictates that you can't have complex strategies. You have to go for a sort of lowest denominator strategy, which, of course, in the Russian case is waves of human attacks, it's mass artillery barrages, but without necessarily the sort of precision guided stuff that we've seen, and the sort of drone guided and satellite communications that clearly the Ukrainians have got the benefit of. You're forced to use fairly sort of dumb, decades old sort of strategies, aren't you?
Yeah, the other thing is if you encourage the soldier to think for themselves and make their own decisions, they might make a decision that they don't like you because you're intimidating them. So that's a fastest way for mutiny. So Russians, they cannot allow that. So yeah, they can only rely on these, as you said, artillery barrages, kind of the same way they used them in First World War, almost creeping barrage when they bomb something for an extremely long period of time, then they send some troops in and then they bombard it again. So they cannot even coordinate their ground attacks with the air force because they don't have the positions in the military, like people in these positions necessary for this system. In the USA, there are middlemen who coordinate this air force versus ground force. They coordinate these attacks. In Russia, they don't even have the positions for these middlemen to coordinate it. So it's just not possible in that army structure.
And given what we're seeing there are these rumors of a big Russian offensive. There are rumors of new mobilization. There are rumors of, new equipment, etc. But there doesn't seem to be the sort of satellite evidence of this happening. And if that offensive has begun, as the Ukrainian military seem to think it has, it's not going particularly well. So on this 1-year anniversary, does Russia have really any leverage to get any wins or victories out of this? Or is the best they can hope with their sort of fairly primitive tactics a kind of attrition and stalemate? I mean, where do you think this is going?
I think the best thing for Russia to happen right now is peace on the lands they have gathered. So if I've talked about it so much in my videos because I get these comments: "Make peace, not war. Make peace. I'm not against this war." This is straight from the Kremlin's playbook. If they're doing bad on the battlefield, they need peace, and right now they're pushing for the peace. And we're expecting Xi Jinping tomorrow to hold a speech talking about, that Ukraine and Russia should make peace. So if anyone wants this war to end right now, with the borders right now, just in any way end this war, they should know that this is what Russia wants. This is what Kremlin wants. So they need peace. And the good thing, the thing what should go on, the war, like, it's horrible to say this, but the war should go on right now. It's this timing right now, it definitely should not end. It should go on. Russia is weak, getting weaker. And how do you say it in English? Like, you hammer a metal until it's hot.
Right?
This is
Yes. Yeah.
this is the time to attack, charge. I think we might expect a Ukrainian counterattack, a bigger Ukraine just recently mobilized 6 new assault brigades, and the training will take time, of course, but Western armor is going to arrive also, and Rasputitsa, the mat season, is going to end a little bit before summer. So I think immediately if Rasputitsa ends, maybe May, I think we can expect a big Ukrainian counteroffensive, taking back some vital towns and land.
And I think that's critical as well, to not reward the aggressor, because what we're seeing and what some of my guests have pointed out is that if we allow a dictator like Russia, if we allow this imperial mindset that really belongs in the 18th and 19th century to have a resurgence, that upsets the entire world order. It means that no borders are secure. It means that the rule of law counts for nothing. And I think even China does not want to see a world. I mean, Taiwan aside, which is a separate issue, China does not want to see the world descend into chaos where everybody's fighting over borders. And let's face it, if you were to look at the borders in Europe, so many territories have been occupied by one country, then another, then another, then another, and changed hands so many times. No one really wants to open that kind of Pandora's box, except, of course, Russia. They seem to be the only guys on the planet who feel that this sort of chaotic world order is somehow in their favor.
I'm no historian, but it feels like European democratic societies are settled societies, and they have fought countless wars. Everybody has occupied everybody else. I mean, if you look at European map, speed forward, it's like colors everywhere, and every empire changes to every other empire. And I think with that experience and about 70 years of democracy and economic growth, European countries don't want to go back there. Definitely not. It feels like they're not a teenager of a country anymore. They're like this 30, 40-year-old man who can control their impulses and can analyze their thoughts and feelings. This is how I feel about European countries. Russia feels more like a very impulsive, like a teenager perhaps who has issues controlling their impulses and maybe has complexes and a violent history. And yeah, European countries don't want to go back, so much so that even right now when war is going on, it's a bit difficult for them, for example, like Germany, to support Ukraine or use weapons or even think about weapons as a mean of doing something. So yeah.
I think I've compared Russia to a toddler in some of my videos.
A toddler, that's even better.
It seems far less rational even than a teenager. And
oh yeah, completely.
I've actually got a teenage daughter. Well, she's not a teenager anymore, but so I kind of know the comparison does hold some weight there. They can be a little irrational at times. But of course, Russia's unpredictable, or actually entirely predictable, aggressive behavior, that is prompting a militarization that we haven't seen since the Second World War. And I think you've covered this in a couple of your videos, which are absolutely fascinating. From the Japanese point of view, they're militarizing incredibly rapidly, more perhaps from the threat from China, but also Poland is emerging as an extraordinary European power. And actually the center of gravity, I think, is going to be shifting from, Western Europe, France and Germany. It's perceptibly shifting east, isn't it? Both in terms of policy making, but also in terms of military strength.
I don't feel like it, but Poland is, even I've talked about this to an Estonian chancellor of the defense ministry, and they, of course, say, yeah, Poland is the greatest ally of NATO in Eastern Europe. But Poland scares me because Poland is fined by the European Union 1 million per day for anti-democratic means and procedures in their country. They don't have the division of power, which in no other country in the EU has this issue except for Hungary also. And in Poland also there's a fear of there's election coming up. There's actually a fear of forging the elections, which I feel like Poland is moving away a little bit from the EU or the government. I mean, not the Polish people, the government, the people support being in the EU, and the fact that they are buying so much weapons. They're buying a lot more weapons than they would need to take on Belarus or Russia at the moment. They're buying so much weapons, and they have this they don't have this division of power. They're moving slowly away from democratic, means of governing a country. So this scares me a little bit. I don't know if I'm maybe scared too easily about this. Every country should be happy when Poland is strong, but I would be more strong when they would be fully pro-EU, because Estonia so much depends on the EU and NATO, and we have Poland very close to us, getting extremely powerful, moving slowly away from the EU in my eyes. So I'm glad that they are balancing out the Russian factor, but I'm confused, honestly. The EU is finding them, so
yeah. It's an unknown, isn't it? Because Poland hasn't been a cohesive and strong power for, well, several centuries. So I guess no one really knows where that might end up.
Oh, yeah. It's scary because Polish people are proud. They have this very strong nationalistic, I'm not saying far right or anything, I'm just saying like a national pride. And Estonians don't have that. Estonia has never been an empire. We have never been a big country like Poland, Lithuania has, the biggest country in Europe, right? At one point. So the Polish people have very different attitude towards their nation and country than Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians do. Even the Finnish, who have never been an empire also. So the Polish might have this potential for some wants to be an empire, you know.
And Russian propaganda has been sort of stirring that up. And Poland has been incredibly supportive of Ukraine, it has to be said. And as you say, the Polish people are generally, extraordinarily hardworking, and I think their sentiment is towards, democratic institutions and so on. So there's maybe some cause to be sort of positive there. But this is something that Russian propagandists have really jumped all over, claiming that Poland is going to carve up Europe, it's going to, divide Ukraine, the western half, which is absurd from our standpoint today. But I'm fascinated. One of the reasons I set up the channel was to counter Russian propaganda narratives, and of course, they are different in every single country. Russia applies to throw spaghetti at the wall, and it tests out different messages in different countries. I'd love to hear, what are the narratives that they are still trying to spin in Estonia? And of course, you have quite a large Russian-speaking population, which has been seen as a strategic risk in the past.
The thing is, the weird part is, 10 years ago, they connected to the Russian-speaking population of Estonia. Now, we have this party in Estonia called EKRE, Eesti Konservatiivne Rahvaerakond, EKRE, Estonian Conservative People's Party. And they are a far-right party in Estonia, and they show themselves as fully for Estonian. We're doing the Estonian thing. We're Estonian nationalists, basically. But it doesn't matter if you're an Estonian nationalist or a Russian nationalist. The connections are very obvious. And everything this party speaks for Estonia, I see it like the decisions they want to make if they get in power will only benefit Russia. Leave the EU, don't support Ukraine. They say don't support Ukraine because Estonia needs it. Like they say they're doing it for Estonia, but in my eyes, I would even go as far as to call them Russian collaborators or Russian agents, because they're the only party in Estonia that want to stop supporting Ukraine because we need these weapons in Estonia. Well, the truth is we don't. We have these weapons for protection against Russia. Ukraine is taking away Russian capabilities. The best way for protection against Russia is to give these weapons to Ukraine. And Russia, as you asked, Russia is connecting this narrative to the Estonian and far-right nationalists who are anti-Russian on paper. But the bigger picture is, which they don't see themselves, I think, is that the decisions they make for Estonia are good for Russia.
And how, it's very weird. I mean, popular might be the wrong word, but what's do they have representation in parliament? What is their polling figures? And do they have much penetration into the media?
Unfortunately, they are extremely popular. That's why I'm afraid the far right is on the rise in Europe, and that's very scary. And that plays right into Kremlin's playbook, because they can mobilize the far rights of any nation in Europe and use them as weapons for Russia. They have 20% of the votes in Estonia, which is incredibly scary. I would say the biggest internal threat for Estonia is Estonian Nationalist Conservative Party, EKRE. And I hope some Estonians are watching this. This is like, I am like this prophet right now, like stop them, please, because this is very dangerous for Estonia. Even I think they would be like Russia is a less of a threat right now than they were a year ago, because the 40,000 troops on the border of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are grinded up in Ukraine. We have proof of that. There's not many troops on the border right now, not many capabilities at all. But then we have this EKRE in Estonia, who is almost exactly continuing Kremlin's sentences and ideology. And that is very dangerous for my country.
And is there a similar effort in Lithuania and Latvia as well? Is there a similar process to try and undermine their statehood?
I'm not really sure. I would guess there is. Being next to Russia, I'm sure Russia is finding a way to fund these far-right movements. But I don't really know much about that.
And my last question, though, then really relates back to that, and it seems extraordinary to me. And I remember having conversations with some Hungarians as well, who are sort of sympathetic to Orban and sympathetic to
Mm,
Russia. And I find it absolutely extraordinary that you know your countries could be occupied for a period of time, decades, and the impact of that, the negative impact, should be absolutely obvious to everybody.
yeah.
And also, something I've seen very movingly in, interviews you've done and conversations you've done, people even have family histories where they suffered hugely at the hands of the Soviet Union and Stalin, especially, if you have ancestors who were in any way involved in politics, liberal intelligentsia, teachers, anyone with an influential position in society, terrible suffering within family memory. I find it extraordinary that despite all of that, people will allow, Russian control and narratives to creep back in to their heads.
That shows how like Russia is quite poor on the battlefield, but on the propaganda front, they're doing actually very good. I would say I don't want to compliment them, but they're really good at propaganda. That is the field that they shine at. And in Europe, especially in Hungary also, where the prime minister is directly talking Kremlin's talking points, making decisions that are benefiting Russia very strongly. I mean, Russia has a very strong foothold with ideology in Hungary, and I've gotten countless comments from Hungarian people um, justifying Orban because, oh, we're a small country, we're landlocked, we don't have oil and gas. Well, Estonia doesn't have any resources. We have 1 million people. We don't have money or nothing, and we're still strongly opposing Russia. I mean, unfortunately, Orban has been extremely good in turning his people also, changing the mindset of Hungarian people. I mean, Soviet war crimes in Hungary were they were big. They
Yeah.
only 2 generations ago people were shot, and now I don't want to say people are pro-Russian, but Orban definitely is pro-Russian. The way he makes his decisions, they benefit Kremlin. So get ready for hate comments.
Yeah, let's bring it. I don't get too many, fortunately.
Okay.
My audience is far smaller, and most of the comments, about sort of 98% of them, are positive. But I imagine you get, with your unambiguous, very clear and commendable statements, you must get a lot of trolling and negativity.
I do, yeah, I do.
Do you just
But
ignore it? I mean, what's the trick to just not read the comments and
I mean, if it's a Pregosian's bot, I can immediately notice it. If they're giving away any kind of they're getting smarter because before they used to spam, oh, Putin did nothing wrong, simple populistic sentences. Now they're falling into these long discussions with people on my commentary, not saying directly that Russia is right. They're just saying, oh, Ukraine is doing some mistakes and Ukrainian army is spreading this very mild distrust in the Western, reader. But I know how to spot it, and I immediately hide user from channel. You can
yeah.
with
Yes,
one click, I'm just cutting them all out. I don't want to give them any ground. So I'm being very dictatorial on that part. The freedom of speech in my commentary doesn't exist. If it's pro-Kremlin, I'm not going to listen to it. I'm going to cut it out.
and
That's
you're
my
tuned
mindset.
into the narratives. You can spot, common threads when they come up, which would be, oh, it's not worth it. Ukrainians would be much better off if they made peace. Ukrainian losses are
Exactly.
just as
Yeah.
much as Russian ones. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. This is not straight like, oh, Russia, hurrah. It's like a bit softer, and people
no.
might read them because they don't suspect it. But I know what they are. I know what they want to do, and what's the goal behind this sentence. It's to undermine the Western efforts to support Ukraine. And yeah, I'm just gonna immediately uh, take away the commenting rights of these people. And yeah.
It's a sort of subtle whataboutism, isn't it? What about the US? What about Iraq? What about this? What about that? What about corruption in Ukraine? What? So, you know, there's corruption in Berlin. Does that mean, you're going to commit a genocide against Berlin? I mean, it's
Exactly.
nonsensical
Yeah.
when you think about it. Um,
Yeah.
Well, I think you're doing sort of tremendous work on your channel. I'm so pleased that we got a chance to chat through. And, on this 12-month anniversary, I'm not going to ask you to make predictions, but are you still optimistic that Ukraine will triumph?
Yes, I am. I think Ukraine will win this war, and it will take time because Russia is very slowly gaining ground on the battlefield. But it's a war of logistics, as you said. And if you win the war of logistics, it doesn't matter who gains ground on the battlefield. In the end, they will lose that ground, like we saw with the Kharkiv front and Kherson front. With 1 to 2 days, they lost entirely vast areas of land. So this will happen again and again if Russia loses the war of logistics, with what they are losing it right now, actually. So I think Ukraine will win, but I don't know when.
And this is why I think, the work that you're doing and the work of other commentators, YouTubers, journalists, and experts is so important, because if the war is going to be won or lost based on logistics and the best economical deployment of those logistics, which we know the Ukrainians can do, then keeping awareness of Ukraine front in mind of the Western public, ensuring that we continue to supply the materials and weaponry that Ukraine needs, that is what is going to win. And it's in Russia's long-term interests, I think, also that they lose badly and that their current system collapses.
It
So
is.
all around, yeah, great stuff you're doing. And I hope you have the energy to keep it up at the same pace.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a very nice talk. About the energy is, yeah, at the fall, September, October, November, and December, when there was these huge counterattacks, I burned out. I did it almost every day, and I thought I'm gonna rest today. And then I see Ukraine took 3 villages and liberated like 1,000 kilometers. I'm like, okay, I cannot rest. I have to do it. But now I have a system in this new year, like 1 video, 2 days, 1 video, 2 days, just to keep like mechanically force myself to rest, because I'm a person who would burn out. I would just go and feel guilty not making a video, and now I have this mechanical rhythm. It's just like, okay, it's a rest day. It doesn't matter if Biden went to Ukraine. I didn't make a video immediately about it. So yeah.
And sometimes the quality, isn't it? If you have that time to sort of think and plan a little bit and maybe put a bit more time into the edit, then the quality is better as well.
Yeah.
Well, it's absolutely brilliant. I wish you luck with the channel. I mean, you've already achieved a vast amount with it. And yeah, it's a huge pleasure speaking to you. And I hope that we, get the privilege to do that again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Artur.